We're on. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first Strategic Planning Committee meeting for this school year. I think we all know each other, so I'm not going to go through that, but I'm just going to remind everybody we do have a hard stop at 9 o'clock. So let's be respectful of the time and just keep to the agenda items as much as possible. The first order on the agenda is the role of the strategic planning. I did send you a big overview of what we are supposed to do. Dr. De Silva, do you want to lead us through this, please?
Sure, I'm glad to do that. So last year, Ken and Jonathan, you might remember that while the committee, I think, it's in terms of the name, right? The title, strategic planning, what does that really mean? And I think there were times in which we were losing focus of what we really wanted as an outcome. So we came back to the Board of Education goals, which all of you have, as well as the district priorities, and then ultimately, identified what really the purpose of the strategic planning was, and there's lots of definitions to that, and also just the role. In general, the committee intends to work collaboratively with the administrative team, but it is a Board of Education. It is a Board of Education committee. And so you, based on your direction, that's how we'll come prepared for these meetings. And ultimately, what we're looking at is the progress towards the district's mission and vision of the graduate. It's intended to use data, identify trends, as well, current trends, as well as upcoming needs, and opportunities to meet the goals, again, that we have set forth in the Board of Education, the district priorities, and/or the mission and the vision of the graduate. And then we know, as you know, we have a policy, 0200, that the board may annually develop a long-range plan based on its goals and priorities. And there's a couple of things I think also just to add to this with the master plan around facilities that Joe will be working on for the remainder of this year and the coming year. Again, you have your district priorities, which are really led by the administrative team, but in support of the Board of Education goals. So that's really, I would say, if anything, just setting the purpose of this committee that was defined really last year, Tina, before you were chair.
Thank you. We can talk about this in the goals, but I did have a document that listed, some short-term and long-term goals. And correct me if I'm wrong, this we can identify feeder patterns, alignment of the elementary schools, a transportation study, because that aligns with the mission and vision of the graduate, trying to do equitable education for all kids, right? So this will be something we can work on, and we can identify if these need to be short-term or long-term goals and how we need. I will like to say for this committee, this will be a working committee. We need to do this as consistently as possible and be able to do these meetings so that we can move the work forward. I think we all agree, and I think Dr. De Silva agrees also, that the more we keep pushing this off, the more time goes. We keep hearing about it. It's been 4 years, 5 years, whatever it is. I think we need to remember that. So I will just remind the committee that we will be working as much as possible, collectively, collaboratively with the administration. Will anybody like to give me a recap of where we left off last time before we started this year? Ken, Dr. Silva, anyone?
I'm glad to jump in, Ken, or you can, and I'll see if I identify. Okay. So again, like I said, it was a committee that I think was really trying to identify with clarity what its purpose was. And so there were really 3 main items that we were looking at, and one was kind of just over here in the periphery. The first was intended to look at, as you defined it, Tina, is look at the enrollment projections, the building conditions, and really look at what we might consider as short-term and long-term goals. And so we had some guiding questions. And one of the first ones that we looked at is, when does the enrollment impact the student learning experience at CERMS? And really primarily for you, I guess, Selena, but maybe for all of us, just as a reminder, we did have a meeting on June 21st, where our principals at the time, both Tim Salem, and at the time it was Trish Ranieri, communicated out, and actually the assistant principals as well, communicated out what they saw as some of the challenges in the current year, but also years to come. And so they didn't just look at the projections, but operationally, when does it start to impact the experience that the students are having at one or the other school? And so both principals spoke to that. Specifically, they were looking at the high projections, the medium projections, and the low projections. And really, once they, in the medium projection framework, they were identifying that perhaps in 2 to 3 years, I believe, if I remember correctly, that we would be at a point at CERM specifically where the experience would change. And sometimes that's not just the experience within the classroom, but the ability to use other spaces for other activities throughout the school day. And so there were other guiding questions that we were looking at as well. Is, do we need to consider the feeder schools in order to optimize the experience for students in the middle school? Does the declining enrollment at any point identify a need to consolidate elementary schools? What are the efficiencies, if any, that can be actualized if the district were to consolidate elementary schools? And are the condition of the district's physical facilities, supportive environments for students? And that's where ultimately we ended up with Joe looking at a master plan for facilities. But of all of those sub-guiding questions, I think the one that really resonated is looking at the feeder patterns into those middle schools and when we're going to have to make shift, and if there's policy implications. And Tina, I think it may have been you, and this is really jogging my memory, but it may have been you that brought up whether or not we needed to have a policy so that families understood that this is something that we were consistently, or maybe it was you, Ken, that we were consistently looking at. So that's a recap there. Then we looked at transportation, which, typically was a topic that that resonated really mostly during the budget season, but we really wanted an opportunity to look at transportation outside of the budget season. In particular, we have an RFP that will go out soon, if that's the plan still, Dawn. But we also looked at whether or not there was opportunity to optimize. And so one of the questions that came from one of our board members was whether or not if we were to have students opt in or perhaps opt out of busing, whether or not we would find some efficiencies. And while there's some challenges with that, and Dawn will speak to the board policy and the law, we did look at studying that further and identifying whether or not there was an opportunity to find some efficiencies. And we'll get to that, I think, from Dawn in item C. We actually put the benefits to electric busing over here, but that was a topic that came up as well, was there a benefit for electric busing? Does the district want to further explore having all elementary schools on the same tier? And do the results of any transportation study have an impact on, I think Chef's Warehouse just dropped a pot on my head, have the ability to influence decisions on start times? So all of those were guiding questions. Again, some of those may still resonate now, others may not. Some may take priority, and it's really up to the committee or the board to provide us some direction. And again, like I said, we will certainly ask Dawn to give us an update from where we were last. And then lastly, the topic around pay to participate came up, and whether or not we wanted to continue with this model. And I think we've done a good job, at least before actually the budget process, to begin talking about what the financial impact would be on eliminating pay to participate. And are there other models within other communities that we wanted to consider? So as you all know, Mr. Street looked at 2 lanes of pay to participate. One which subsequently was, I'm going to use the right terms, I don't know if it's removed or added, but it was added back into the budget, which was the weight room fees that families pay for. So that was added back into the budget last night. Although Dane had removed that fee to families in his initial proposal. However, we still do have the elimination of, I want to say it's about $35,000 in pay to participate fees on the athletic side. That is still currently in the budget, and we're hopeful that that will continue. And as you know, Mr. Street explained a 5-year proposal on how to eliminate pay to participate fees completely. And so this year, I think the impact is about $35,000, and I may need to be corrected on that number, but that's where we are with that. And so those were the 3 big priorities that this committee identified last year. I think 2 of them probably still resonate, but I think that there's an opportunity to look at the guiding questions and see where you want to go from there, and perhaps highlight some versus another. Again, this is the Board of Education's committee, so you'll give us direction, and based on what you would like us to consider, we'll do that. And then shortly, whenever you're ready, we can have Dawn provide an update on transportation and what's been done so far this year. And I know that she's anticipating before she leaves us, so it would be February 28th, Dawn, her last board meeting, to provide an update to the full board.
Thank you. Dawn, do you want to just give us a quick update, and then we can go back, we can all discuss our long-term and short-term goals?
Sure, happy to. When we left off this committee, we had kind of a draft goal to look at where we could reduce the cost of busing while ensuring that our students arrive at school safely and on time. One of the directions was to review the opt-in, opt-out process. We did send a study out to parents and asked them, if you were given the opportunity to opt out of busing, would you just for AM, just for PM, or opt out completely AM and PM? When we got the results back, we had 873 submissions for that study. Of that, 126 opted out of both AM and PM. Only 8 opted out of PM rides, and 46 opted out of AM rides. Out of 4,500 students, that's only about 19% overall that really took advantage of the study to review. One of the questions that we had in there was, if you're unsure, which is one of the problems of opting out at the beginning of a school year, you don't know what your situation is going to be throughout the year, then don't opt out. Let us make sure we have a seat for your student for the school year. Some of the pros and cons that we were looking at when we did the opt-out study, the pros and cons were, let's see, the difficult to route when an opt-out student needs to come back in. What's a notification and timeline for that? How do we have to restructure the routing for the buses? What bus is going by that particular student's home? The most difficult area for that would be the middle schools and the high school, as they are more broad around town, as opposed to the elementary schools are a little bit more centralized in their location. Looking at that, it would not necessarily change the number of buses that we would need per state statute. And we also needed to take into consideration the all hazards plan, which indicates in an emergency situation, should we have to move all students at one particular point in time, we need a seat on a bus or some type of vehicle to get those students where we need them to be. Another area that we looked at was, if doing the opt-in, opt-out, would it be a possibility to shorten the time between tiers, allowing for more accurate arrival and departure times? We have completed pulling down the power school detail for the particular 126 that opted out AM, PM, and are starting to do a review of where those locations are. And like I said, the other con for that was, in the beginning of a school year, most parents don't really know what their situation is going to be throughout the year, and then it could possibly change as well. We were looking at possible reduction in route times to offer earlier return home for the 4-tier schools. That is something that would still have to be looked at based on if we could shorten the times between tiers. And that's kind of where we are at this point.
Thank you.
Dawn, can I just, Tina, is it okay if I ask a few follow-up questions?
Yes.
Dawn, I know that one of the concerns that we had early on when this was proposed, and it was the proposal for us to study opt-in, opt-out started during the budget process, because there was, I think, a belief that we could find some efficiencies if we just picked up the students that actually needed a ride. Now, this was happening, running parallel to this was the cohorting, the hybrid model that we were in, right? So you remember there were empty buses all around town because we were only picking up half the kids, and half the kids, even half of the half sometimes weren't being picked up because their parents preferred to drive them. The windows were open and all those kinds of things. But that said, the concern at that time was that, well, there were several, but one of them would be if a parent did change their mind, as you described, we're obligated by law to provide them with transportation. We understand that. And I think most parents would be okay if we gave them a reasonable changeover time, right? 24 hours, let's just say. But in order to do that, depending upon where that child lives, they would need to be, the whole bus would need to be rerouted. And so all of those kids that might be picked up, and Dawn, please correct me if I'm wrong, all of those kids that might be picked up at a particular time now would have a shift in their time, in their pickup time, right? And or their drop off time, because if they're normally
Very
being picked up
possible.
at 8:04 and now I had to pick up a kid down here, that's 8:07, right? And the next kid, and it has that domino effect. So that was one concern that was raised, because we are legally obligated to provide every child with a ride to school, given our, obviously we know our topography and what's happening in Ridgefield with respect to that. But then having to make that change, and I already know, because we've been, as you know, we've had a vacant position, not for much longer. We have that position filled, someone to start soon, but we've had a vacant position. So Dawn has been, you know, fielding many of the bus calls, and I a few in comparison, but parents can get incredibly frustrated both in the morning and or the afternoon when their time changes, because they're dependent on it, right? Whether it's to pick up another child, whether it's to get to work, whatever the situation is. And so, you know, I think that is a variable we have to consider. And then to Dawn's point is then what happens if you don't have enough buses in the fleet, or other issues arise, such as an emergency situation, and now we're looking to bring other buses in and in a very immediate way.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? Selena?
When you all were doing the transportation study, did you take into consideration how you could merge better start times, smarter start times? So when you're doing the studies, are you just looking at the buses and changing over the contracts and then working in the start times? Because, you know, if you had like 2 tiers, it would be much easier to work in later start times for the high school, right? As opposed to like right now, it's so hard with our 4-tier system.
So that wasn't the goal of this work, and at least in the time that I've been here, Dawn, that was completed before.
Long before I started.
So since that time, Selena, shifting over the tiers, I mean, that's definitely a budget conversation that would have to be had, or really if that's, I'm not sure which one comes first, budget or the conversation, but however way this board wants to revisit it. But I do know that it was a study that happened shortly before me, I think, or a couple of years before me. And
Dr. Baldwin, she did do it, right? She did a study. She talked about this. There was a capacity study done by Dr. Baldwin. She talked about the tiers, because at that time, as I'm sure, Selena, you know too, later school times was proposed. There were a few models proposed with different tiers, you know, combining or not combining. And I know there was a cost associated. Dr. De Silva's point, there was always a cost associated. Right. But to your point, and this is where we are coming in as a strategic board committee, if this is something we feel that we need to bring, and this is our short-term or long-term goal, we can talk about it, and then we can bring it to the full board so that they understand it. So if nobody has any questions, I think we can go to the last part of the agenda is our goals. Dr. De Silva did identify, you know, some of the key questions that were brought up. We talked about the enrollment at Scotts Ridge and East Ridge. We have heard from Tim Salem. I've been part of this conversations. The enrollment is impacting the learning and the experience of the school. Is this something the board or the committee needs to identify, that we need to look at our feeder patterns? And while we're looking at those feeder patterns, are we going to look at alignment of our elementary schools? Now, we have to keep in mind, I know this was identified, and maybe I'm wrong, or maybe we need to look at it. that Barlow Mountain and Scotland, because of the way they are physically, maybe they cannot be, they cannot open at the same time. They cannot be on the same time. How does that impact about the learning of the elementary schools? It's just a question. I have no answers. I'm just sharing something that was brought up a few years ago at a study done when Dr. Baldwin was superintendent. While we're looking at that, sorry, Jonathan, yes.
Just wanted to say, it's not that they can't, it's not that Scotland and Barlow can't be on the same start times. However, in order to do that, the town would have to do a capital project to change the
roads,
the
yes.
roadways and the approaches.
Yeah, it's just the whole driving there. Yes, absolutely. Sure. Thank you. You're right. And while we're looking at that, are we looking at the high school? Is that something we need to identify? And it all leads back to transportation, right? Everything is tied to the 4 tiers. From my understanding, we went to 4 tiers, and correct me if I'm wrong, I'm still not that old from this district. We went to 4 tiers to save money. It has always been about budget impact. So whatever we will do, whatever we decide as a committee and bring to the board, and the board supports us, if there will be budgetary impact. So I think it befits us to identify a short term, and short term, I mean 1 to 2 in a long range goal, and we can have timelines to work through that. But I want to hear what you all think are short term goals first. I would bring feeder patterns into it because I think it's important, because we've had Mr. Salem say this many times. It is impacting the learning of the kids in our middle schools. Scotts Ridge is physically not built to handle so many kids. Now, I don't know how enrollment is unknown, right? It can go up, go down, projections can come up and off. It's just, that's my starting point, but I want to hear what the committee thinks. Ken?
I think because of the contract and the RFP that's coming up, I think the shortest term focus needs to be on transportation. And as we've noted and has been noted in the past, everything sort of ties into that.
Selena, yes.
Yeah, I think you do sort of have to have a big picture to have your short-term goals. Otherwise, if they don't line up, then you're kind of going to start over again. Do you know what I mean? So I think transportation is huge, but I think we also need to look at the healthy start times in conjunction with that, because if we could do both together. And I know Dr. Silva's mentioned several times about like buying a bus or whatever. In my mind, I'm like, if we had 1 extra bus, that would take care of those people, those stragglers. I know it's a big ask, and we're not going to get that right now. But I mean, I think we should consider the transportation along with healthier start times. We need to work in conjunction. We can do that together. Otherwise, we might get a contract that doesn't work at all with that. And we're telling the parents again, we don't really care about the high school students and their sleep habits.
Jonathan?
Yeah, I was just going to agree that in order to set the short-term goals, we should maybe take a look at what the long-term goals are. And if we kind of bucket things into long-term goals first and then put short-term goals underneath them, if we look at building capacity and utilization as a long-term goal and put feeder patterns, redistricting policy underneath that as shorter term. Same thing with
Middle.
School start times, and put transportation and tiers underneath that. So times, tiers, transportation all go together, but we need to know where we're rowing before we take that first row.
Agreed. Totally agree. So, all right, let's identify our long-term goals.
I think healthy start times would be a valid goal.
And that would identify, and that also includes the elementary, right? Healthy start times.
Yeah, that doesn't mean it's not start school later. It's healthy start
times for all
times
schools.
for our students.
For all schools. Do we identify feeder patterns?
I
think
think
that's
sorry, Jonathan.
go ahead.
I'm having trouble seeing because my eyes are messed up from being on the computer last night for so long. So I think transportation is a goal, but that's also a feeder pattern for the start time. So I don't know, where do you all want to put that?
It's like a
one
Venn I
recommend-
think it's like a Venn diagram.
Yeah,
So it's the transportation's gonna affect several different areas.
when you get into that, I highly recommend just having maybe Cheryl from the bus company or Vinny, her supervisor, come in and speak to you. If you're going to be looking at changes in busing or routing or times, just get their perspective as to how they run the buses and what the buses can and can't do, and what challenges they have versus what flexibility they may have.
Can
when
I
you
just
look at
ask
routing, it's-
clarifying? Oh, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, when you're looking at the routing, it's really, the limiting factor is not seats, it's minutes.
It is minutes, yep. They talked about downtime, right? The dead time or whatever. They came and she talked about that. Was it last year? I'm sorry. Everything bleeds into each other. But I know they talked about it, but I appreciate that. I also know when they talked about when the study was done, God, it's only 2017. It's been what, 5-6 years. They also talked about the same thing. It was just getting that together. And then I think that's an important point you made, Dawn, which I think we need to address. We don't really lose any buses, right? That's where we were thinking we don't. We need X amount of buses to serve all our kids because we
Right.
need that.
And,
So I
and
think,
if you shorten the time, Tina, you're going to have to add buses.
and that costs, right? At the end of the day, it costs. So
Well,
I think because transportation is up, our contract is up, I think that's something we need to identify, maybe how that will look for us. We said healthy start times for all schools. The feeder patterns I go back to because the more we delay, the Scott's rate, it impacts the learning, which Mr. Salem has said many times, but I don't know how that fits because it goes back to transportation, to Selena's point, right? But, and I know why this was done. I know Dr. Baldwin did this because it's true. We had a small portion of Barlow Mountain going to East Ridge and it was not fair to these kids to be split. But it also goes back to enrollment in all the 3 schools versus those side 3 schools. So how do you guys want to handle this? Dr. De Silva, do you have any ideas?
I actually just wanted to take a step back for a minute around healthy start times, and I'm not opining on the value or not value, but I think you need to define what that actually is or how this board is planning on defining that. And I don't know the history obviously as well as some of you do or all of you do. But I do know there was a lot of surveys between kids, the athletics department, and, I'm not here to identify what a community values. I'm here to figure out ways and to support what a community values. But I think it's very important that becomes clear. Jonathan?
No, I was just going to echo onto that. If this committee wants to think of that as a goal, then we would certainly want to bring back the idea of that as a goal of this committee to the full board to get buy-in or not.
Agreed. And you're right, Dr. De Silva, there was a survey. I know that the high schools students were not big fans of that because they have their lives. They have a system set up. I'm not advocating either for that. But to Jonathan's point, this is something we bring back to the board because it does have budget impacts.
Well, it has budget impacts, but it also has time impact. And so just as I said before, I support my role as the superintendent is support what the community values, what the Board of Education is asking us to do, but clarity around that, because otherwise we could be spending a lot of time. So are we saying healthy start times for the high school? Are we saying healthy start times for elementary kids? What does that actually mean? Are we saying all kids on one tier? Are we saying kids are coming in too late? Some kids are going in too early. Some kids are leaving too late, however way you define that. I would highly recommend that be really clear before we start this work, because it is a ton of work. And so when we're doing A, then we're not doing B, and we're glad to do A or B, but just be clear about what that is, because I do know that there was a lot of heavy lifting, agree or disagree with them, but the superintendents before me for sure. And, I think sometimes the biggest challenge for committees is we could be spinning our wheels and not getting to a solution for something. And I think it's important that we have a really clear road in which to travel.
And I also, a lot of high schools, when this first started, I mean, my kids were teenagers, big fans, and their kids of starting later. I saw a huge impact, especially on my child with learning disabilities. So we need to be careful about, we hear from the loudest people who are against things always. So I do agree though with Dr. De Silva. I think we need to have a very clear-cut plan because we can talk things to death. So, and we need to definitely include the elementary children. I think that was totally lacking last time. Nobody wants their kids, waiting in the dark. So, but I think we could do that. I think that's, and I really think an extra vehicle, I think that would really help. In some way that will play in. That's a really good idea if we could start doing that. That extra money you took out of the budget, Dr. De Silva would have really bought a nice vehicle. So maybe next year.
Ken.
Just a couple of things, and Dawn, and this may be something that I heard or misremembered, but didn't at one point years ago, didn't we own our buses?
Ridgefield's never owned their buses.
Never have?
No.
We should.
And we'll see how this works out with these two. Remember, these aren't really buses. I mean,
No,
for some of us, it's probably what we ride around on the weekend, right? If we have a boatload of kids, it's just enough for them. But the reality is we'll see how this plays out, but it's transportation is complicated. And I think we need to be very thoughtful about how, this is a great start. I do think that there's opportunities for savings, perhaps, or maybe even creative thinking around athletics and the transportation around athletics. Selena, the only point I would say it's not one bus. When we start changing tiers, it's not one bus. It's a lot of buses.
Dozens.
And the one thing I do remember when I transitioned to Ridgefield, Dawn had just finished up some work with Edulog, and I remember asking the question, was there a charge here to go from 4 tiers to 3 tiers? And they, right off the bat, they said, yeah, there's a charge. My definition of charge was different. Was there a goal? There was a different kind of charge, and we're talking about millions of dollars. And again, that may be what this community values, and that's fine. But I think we just really need to be clear about where we were, what's changed, what do we value, and then you give us our marching orders and we'll try to sort it through or give you at least the most honest feedback that we can give you. But and just to add to this, it's in school districts, lots of things happen at the same time, right? So right now we're saying we'd love to have all of our elementary schools. Perhaps we're saying we'd love to have our elementary schools on on the same schedule. Running parallel to that, I have a whole committee that's been working all year trying to get early morning care and contracts related to that, right? And hopefully that works out for those families, or afternoon care. But there's that happening. Then we're saying, okay, let's look at healthy start times, which maybe what we mean by that is at the high school, well, we're getting ready to go into negotiations with a transportation provider. That's going to hold tight for a few years, right? So those are decisions that have to be thought of, and clarity and purpose makes a big difference. And so, because otherwise we're spinning our wheels, doing a lot of work and ultimately not ending anywhere.
And the other thing that I wanted to say, so that is my understanding of the tiers too. So if we wanted to go from 4 tiers to 3 tiers, that's more buses.
Yes, that'll be more buses. Actually,
that's even more.
$2 million.
Yep, I remember.
At least a few years ago, the 4 tiers to 3 was $2 million.
Yeah, 1.9 something. Yep.
And actually, I had forgotten my thought there, but the feeder patterns, you can't wait for that to do this, to wait for this busing thing. That's, you're going to have to sort through that quickly. So even though I understand that we need big goals, I think that big goal needs to be really clear so that we can get to the work below that, the buckets as Jonathan described.
So building capacity and utilization is the first big goal, and feeder patterns is the first short term.
Agreed.
Underneath that.
Yeah. And there was.
And then maybe we ask the full board for input on what other long-term goals should be part of this committee.
Was a capacity study done too, right? Karen, you would know.
Yep, there was. Dr. Baldwin did that as well.
I remember. I think I have those notes still. But I think it's a good time for us to revisit that because so much has changed. and I remember this was something Dr. Baldwin brought up, and how we educate children has changed, right? So when we talk about enrollment and people look at children declining and they're like, oh my God, kids are declining. But the fact of the matter is how education takes place in a classroom, how we utilize the physical space to educate children has changed. And I think I remember that was the biggest takeaway I took away from that study, because it's beyond just the number of kids in a school. Am I right, Karen?
Tina? Yeah,
Yes.
Tina, to that point, you're absolutely right. Because at that time, the people that did the capacity study said Scottsridge could hold 525 kids and not impact, because they were strictly just doing mathematical number of rooms times 25, which is not necessarily how we, as you said, use our spaces now for, intervention and special education and lots of different, programs.
Yes. So I think going back to that, and the fact that we've had principals come to the board and talk about the feeder patterns and how it's impacting learning. And as Jonathan has said, I think we need to look at feeder patterns as a short-term goal. And how that, do we look at what schools feed into Scottsridge? Do we look about pocket redistricting? I think I'm going to say that word because nobody else will. So
Yeah, you can use the word, you can leave the word pocket off as far as I'm
It's
concerned.
just
It's not just feeder patterns. It's
I was trying to be nice and really being, I'm like, okay, I'm going to get hate. Let me get hate. But we have to look at redistricting, right? How this impacts, how if we shift certain lines, how will that impact to Scottsridge and Eastridge? Is that something we as a committee decide and we can bring to the board? Selena? Okay. Selena, I can't hear you. Sorry.
No, my hand wasn't up. I was
Oh.
just listening.
Okay. So is that okay? We identified that as one goal.
Oh,
So
yes. Sorry. I didn't know you were asking me. I was just.
yeah, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page so
Yeah.
that we can bring it to the board. And if the board has questions, we're all able to address this.
Well, I think that does, if that affects the start times too, right? Redistricting. I mean, I think what you said about healthy start times for all students is very, very important. Redistricting, that affects everything we're doing, affects the big picture. So
I'm not sure that redistricting, as you're thinking about it, Tina, and you'll have to clarify for me, but would impact start times necessarily. I think you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think you're looking at particular roads, particular streets, and shifting those streets from one school to the other. So I don't necessarily think that there's a relationship between start times of schools and redistricting particular streets to go back to what should have been probably a 50-50 model, or at minimum a 60-40 model going to Eastridge. I think they're two, again, I'm just trying to distinguish the work that needs to be done. Because Selena, ultimately those kids are going to go, so when you change a couple of roads, those kids are going to go to either Eastridge or Scottsridge and then ultimately end up at the high school regardless of times. So
I thought we were talking to the middles about going to the middle school. Do the middle schools start at this exact same time?
yes,
They do? Okay.
yes.
it's the feeder patterns. So we used to be 60-40 at Scottsridge and Eastridge. And then the whole, whatever, for the reasons that I've said.
The budget reasons, ultimately.
Yeah,
I mean, it was the same thing. It was budget. They wanted to cut a team at the middle school at Eastridge, and they went to what they thought was a 50-50 model, but it's not even a 50-50 now. So Scottsridge is heavier than Eastridge, and it doesn't have the capacity as Tina described. When they were looking at the number of rooms, yes, the number of rooms. I have a room here too, but you can't put a whole class of kids in here. So you could you can use it for small groups, you can use it for intervention. They've now basically accessed every working space to have kids in there. So in at the detriment of other programs that they might have wanted to have in those spaces. But moreover, you can only fit so many kids in a classroom because it wasn't built for quote unquote 50-50. It was intended to be 60% of the population would go to Eastridge. It's a bigger school. 40% of the population would go to Scottsridge. Now it's not that way. It's either exactly, or it's more at Scottsridge, which we just don't have the capacity for. And that was evident really, if not before that time during COVID, when we could not distance students at Scottsridge at all. We could just barely distance them at the appropriate amount of space at Eastridge, just barely. So I don't think that that's necessarily, Selena, going to impact start times. I think that's a different conversation, but one doesn't necessarily impact the other, at least not right now, and probably shouldn't, because if one needs to happen in a 911 capacity, then that needs to happen, and you can't wait for the other situation to resolve itself, or a budget to resolve itself, to make those changes for Scottsridge and Eastridge, because Scottsridge is bursting at the seams.
And I think to that point, we should, and that's why I go back to the feeder patterns for Scottsridge and Eastridge, because we have heard from the principals, this is critical for them to be addressed. So I think that is a short-term goal, an immediate short-term goal. And I think I go back to Jonathan's point, and I think Dawn said it too. When we're looking at transportation, we can identify that as a long-term, transportation is there. We're going to do the study. We can have them come and talk about, I know there are studies already done. We can talk about that at a board level, how this impacts when we move tiers. What does that mean fiscally? I think it's important that we bring to the board that even if we said, I saw that not very few people took the study, so we really don't have a true picture. And to your point, it doesn't matter whether they opt out or opt in. In the end, if the kid needs a seat, we need the buses. So there's no so-called saving by cutting a bus. So I think that those are long-term goals, in my opinion, to Dr. De Silva's point. And I think Jonathan said it too, transportation, absolutely. And maybe healthier times for all schools has to be something we all work towards as we identify what that looks like, how transportation feeds into that, because this is up now. I think the short-term goal definitely needs to be the feeder patterns. And because we have to give Dr. De Silva and our team some kind of direction of where we want to go. And I keep going back to the feeder patterns because we've had Mr. Salem talk about this, and it is impacting learning for the kids there, how they manage the kids, how they have class sizes, everything. So in my opinion, I think this is something we should identify as a short-term goal that needs to be addressed sooner rather than later. Does that make sense? Is that okay, Dr. De Silva? I think that's something we would like to identify and work towards.
Sure. Again, short-term wise, I think that's has to happen, whether we like it or not. So it has to happen. And I do think that there's a lot of work that also has to happen with the parent population, because you start off at a school, or you think you're going to go to a school, you think you're going to go to a middle school, whatever the case may be. And all of a sudden that changes. It never feels okay. So you need a lot of time to support and transition and prepare. And so I would say that is probably a starting point for us. There may be others as well, but I think this is going to take a lot of energy from the administrative team and from the committee to make sure that we do it and do it right and communicate well.
And this would lead to possibly a policy, right? We've talked about this. I know Ken's mentioned it. It's been mentioned at the board that if we have stuff in policy that identifies that after X amount of years, we will be looking at our numbers and possibly redistricting, whatever word you want to use, it gives whoever is signing up, whoever enrolling in RPS to have an understanding that this is something we've talked about. It's not a surprise. So we can talk about, it kind of links to the policy part of it. And I'm looking at Ken and Selena because they're on policy, just something to keep in mind as you work towards it. So I think that's a good start. I go back to transportation because it's so crucial. It's coming up. And when we're doing transportation, I think I do agree with Dawn. We need them to present to us and talk how this looks, how tiers look, what difference does it make, if any, what it means fiscally. And can we really do this with enrollment? Because that's another time. Yes, Selena, go ahead, sorry.
Do we have to use them? Do we put contracts out for bid? A little competition? And transportation definitely has to do with healthy start times for all. So we have to do that simultaneously. We just have to, because we can't use the 4-tier system, and actually it doesn't work with healthy start times. So but we can't spend that much money. So we need to make sure we get the lowest bid. So we don't have to use for a student, right?
That's what an RFP is, Selena. It's a request for proposal.
I know.
So, all right, so it goes out to.
So I'm saying, so it was a little bit rhetorical. So wouldn't we want several people to present to us?
Yeah, so that's
they should be trying to get our business. This is a lot of money. They should be wooing us.
I wish that was the case, Selena, but right now, if I'm going to be really transparent, I think we're doing the job of wooing. There's many districts have gone out to RFP, and I don't want to get into negotiations in a public meeting. So what I would say is that it is competitive. That's the purpose of the RFP, but prices aren't going down. So I won't speak more about negotiations out, contracts, but they're not, the prices aren't going down. That's what I'll say. And I will say, just because it's important to say that for a student, they're obviously they'll do whatever we tell them to do, obviously for a price, right? Just like any other bus company, they'll tell us what to do for a price. First Student has been incredible for us over the past 2 years. With making sure that our kids were in school every single day. Yeah, there were bumps in the road for some families, but that's definitely there. But again, at First Student or any other bus company for that matter, will do whatever we tell them to do for a price. And it's whether or not that price is something that the Ridgefield Public Schools can swallow. But it is competitive, that's for sure. But there's no wooing happening. It's the opposite.
I'm going to shift gears just a little bit because I know Dr. De Silva talked about this too, and we're almost to the end. We've heard about our building structures, our facilities a lot from Joe. We've heard about it many times. Is this something we need to identify as a short or long-term goals? How our buildings are upkeep, whatever the committee thinks, so that we can bring it to the board? Anyone?
I think that's definitely a valid long-term
Yes.
goal, but I think that actually it's a longer term if there's such a thing. I mean, it's something that we have eyes on through Joe. Joe has eyes on it, and again, it's comes around to what is important to our town as a town. I mean, none of these things are free. And so if, start times are important to people and it's going to cost an extra $2 million, then our budget's going to have to increase an extra $2 million. If, we need a brand new school, then we're going to have to bond a brand new school. So it's, we can, just like with our current budget, we can, these are the things that we feel we need as a district. But if the town doesn't have an appetite for it, it's not going to happen no matter how well we plan it. So yeah, we're keeping an eye on it. I think it's a longer term goal. The current things, the things that we've been talking about for the majority of this meeting, again, primarily because of the bus contract, really need to be at the forefront.
Did Ken freeze for everyone or was me only? He did
I could
freeze.
hear him.
No,
I
I
could
was
hear
like, oh my God. Okay, I thought it was my computer. Okay, I think we go back to transportation. That's what we talk about. I think Selena said that too. Everything ties into transportation. And we have a contract coming up. We're hoping we'll hear more about it, of course. But for now, I think if we're talking about short-term goals, the feeder patterns is important. It is crucial. It is timely. It is needed. And I think we have given direction to Dr. De Silva about that. I will bring this up because it does come up many times and it was identified last year too. Are we thinking, maybe it lines up with elementary schools all being on the same time, but if our enrollment is declining, are we thinking outside the box how we utilize space for elementary? I know when I go back, sorry, I was part of the study. That's why I remember Dr. Baldwin did this study about capacity and she had proposed a shift in the entire way these schools were structured, right? She had I think it was, Karen, you may remember 5 to 6 in one and 6, 7, 8 in the other one. And it was not,
actually,
right?
Yep, there's been several studies. One was done by Deborah Lowe originally, looking at, do we need 6 schools? Can we work on 5? Can we have 3 K2 schools and 3 3-5 schools? Can we look at different combinations of 5, 6, 7, 8? So yes, that work has been done over the years as well.
And the reason I brought it up is because this has been done. People say this hasn't been done. I just want to keep highlighting that the work has been done. The shift in how we look at schools has been done. So if this is something the board eventually wants to look at, the work is already there to look at. It's not like it hasn't been done. And I think after Deb Lowe, even Dr. Baldwin did something like that. Yeah. So it's not
And
too
when,
fast.
yeah, and when Dr. De Silva talks about us trying to support the values of a community, the values of the community at that time were they valued their neighborhood K-5 schools.
Yeah, I remember. Everybody wanted to be in their elementary school. It's, you get attached to it. And even though they're so similar, yet culturally they can also be so different. I remember that. Okay, so as we're
And that's
wrapping,
why feeder patterns won't be easy either. It doesn't change for middle school.
agreed. But the fact is that capacity wise, just physically, it is not possible for Scott's Ridge to hold. It's not because we want to do it. It's because it's a need. It's important. And I go back to Mr. Tim Salem has said it so many times, when it impacts the learning experience of the kids, it's important we address it.
And, just a shameless plug for the curriculum department, but that is one of the reasons that it's so important that our schools have a shared experience, especially when you have multiple schools. Regardless of whether you go to East Ridge or Scotts Ridge, the experience will be the same. The physical plant may look different, the people, the humans look different, but the experience is the same. It's the same with our 6 elementary schools. Yes, there's a beaver at one place and perhaps a Scotty dog at the other, but at the end of and there's a culture with that, there's no doubt. But the academic experience, the emotional experience, the essentials experience should be similar, right? They're not exactly the same, but there's an assured experience at all of these sites, and that's the heavy lift that's been happening over the past couple of years.
All right, so we've identified transportation as the big term goal, which we will talk about and bring to the board. I think Jonathan and we can talk about when to add this to the agenda, just even as an overview to the board. I do think we should maybe give a quick recap to the board, Don, about the transportation study that was done and how much, what replies you got, so that they're aware that not many people took part in that, and whatever, all the, the replies you got, the submissions you got really didn't give us a clear answer either ways. And we go back to the fact that in the end, we still need a seat for every child. And so our short-term goal is the feeder pattern. And as we consolidate the transportation, once we get down to it, we can talk about healthier times as a long-term goal, healthier times for all. I want to keep emphasizing, I think we've missed the parents were upset last time when elementary schools were not in the conversation. So I do want to remember that very much. Did I summarize that okay for the committee?
So Tina, for the administration, and we can, you and I can talk a little bit about next steps after the meeting, but I think what I'm hearing is we should be thinking, number one, policy, right? Is there a policy that we want to look at that helps parents understand the ebb and flow of a school community, and at times how you might be planning for this, but it may shift to this. And then I think the second piece of this is to begin at minimum to study our schools and what shifts could perhaps happen so that we could balance our 2 middle schools more appropriately. Is that what I'm hearing? Okay. And then secondarily, I think what I'm also hearing, which is part of the process anyway, is that we should be collecting feedback. And it's part of the process that Dawn and or her predecessor would engage in, but collecting feedback around perhaps wants, needs, hopes for with the RFP that goes out for transportation.
The committee agree? Yes, totally. Okay, so we have the policy committee has this, we will look at that. You guys will look at that. We have feeder patterns. I'll talk to Dr. Silva about next steps, and we will update at the next meeting. Is there anything, and we have identified transportation leading to healthier times for all kids as the big, broad top goal. And as Ken said, keeping an eye on our facilities too. Longer goal. Anything else? Any of the committee members want to add anything to that? Perfect. We're on time. If nobody else has anything, I'm going to call for a motion to adjourn.
I so move.
All in favor? Adjourn. Thank you, everyone.
Thank